I'd like to welcome you all to the third annual State of the Forum. Earlier this year, the members of the Yacht Club established something called the Great Harbor Yacht Club Foundation, and our mission is dedicated to the promotion of the health of the harbor and its marine environment. So co-sponsoring this forum is a natural fit, and we look forward to working with the town and Emily and the Land Council in our shared goal of preserving the harbor for the benefit of the entire community. We have established a scientific advisory board, and one of the members of the advisory board, Brian von Hudson, is here this afternoon and will be talking later in the program on the past and the present and the future of the harbor. To be brief, Brian is a native son, as it were, grew up in Woods Hole, and has studied projects as far away as the South Pacific, but has spent 2 decades studying eelgrass up and down the Cape. And as a by the way, he holds degrees from Princeton and Caltech and a bunch of other schools. So we're delighted to have him on the advisory board, and I'm sure you'll find this talk informative. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Emily Molden, the Executive Director of the Land Council. Thank you very much for attending.
Okay, good afternoon. I have the pleasure of emceeing this event, so I've been given my own personal microphone. Just let me know if I need to adjust it at all for you. So along with Elliot, I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to the Land Council's third State of the Harbor Forum this afternoon. With me is our small but very effective staff, our new resource ecologist, RJ Turcott, and our development director, Megan Browers. The Land Council is now in its 45th year, and we are continuing to work on the protection and preservation of Nantucket's environment and natural resources. We've always understood the importance and value of water on Nantucket, but in the last 10 years, we have significantly increased our focus on the research, education, and advocacy of policies and practices that help to keep our water clean. Our groundwater, which is our sole source aquifer, the integrity and functions of our wetland systems and salt marshes, along with the overall health of our freshwater ponds and estuaries, including, of course, Nantucket Harbor. I've only been on the island for about 15 years, so my frame of reference is relatively short. I'm sure many of you have seen environmental changes on the island over a much longer time period. I was on a boat up in the head of the harbor a couple of weeks ago on one of our Oyster Farm harbor tours with our friends from Shearwater Excursions. And our captain, Blair Perkins, was relating to us the changes that he has seen and the conditions up there in the head of the harbor in Pulpus Harbor when he was a kid. He was mentioning how he used to catch double his limit of scallops in a single day out of Pulpus Harbor. Now, to me, Pulpus Harbor has some of the worst water quality. It's completely devoid of eelgrass and most life. But those changes that Blair has seen and many others have seen over the course of our lifetimes is why we're all here today. A lot of you have seen more changes. For example, since the 90s, the island has experienced a greater incidence of years of very poor scallop harvest, and last year was a prime example of that. So the work that the Land Council does, we do not do alone. These types of initiatives are much more effective when done in collaboration. So we work very closely with community members, with other organizations and foundations on and off island, and importantly with the town. I've seen over the last 10 years the town also increase their focus on water quality issues in a significant way. And in addition, our conversation about these issues has really begun to shift. Rather than just focusing on water quality, nutrient levels, data collection, while we wait and hope for conditions to improve, we've been collectively having this conversation about what else we can do on a proactive level to help to restore and build more resilience into our harbor ecosystems. On the heels of the 2 coastal resiliency conferences that were held on island last month, I hope you'll all see the importance of some of these efforts. The Land Council has been really proud to be a leader and a driver in this question and is really thrilled with the number of partners that have come out in response. With the help of our members and our supporters and the donors to our water fund, the Land Council's established water fund, we really are just scratching the surface on all of the research and restoration efforts that we hope to move forward with in the future. So we have a great program for you today. We are going to be talking about a lot of these efforts and hope to show you the importance of continuing to really focus on this interface between our changing climate conditions and maintaining a healthy harbor ecosystem. I want to just thank the Great Harbor Yacht Club once again for hosting us today and for bringing Dr. von Hertzen to share his experience and insights to our science here on Nantucket. I also want to make sure I recognize our other sponsors as I drop my program. We had some real support from Elizabeth and Michael Galvin, Visco Pumping, Nantucket Shellfish Association, Anderson Stillwater Moorings, and others. So thank you all so much for your support of the event. I'm going to ask you to just hold your questions until the end so that we can get through the program, and then there'll be a question and answer panel when all the speakers will be up front and you will be able to ask some questions at that time. And then finally, please feel free to stick around afterwards and join us for a drink and raw bar. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Thais Fournier to come up and begin our presentations talking about the state of Nantucket Harbor water.
All right, so this will be a test to my multitasking skills. But thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's great to see such a good turnout. I wish I could say I had 15 years on the island, but I actually just moved here in March. So is that 4 months? So still new, but I am the water resource specialist and I work for the Natural Resources Department. And as Emily had said earlier, the theme for this forum is research and restoration. And so I wanted to talk about the water sampling program that we do, as well how we're doing a collaborative effort between a lot of my coworkers as well as different organizations on island. Okay. So a balance of nutrients are important to maintain a healthy and productive ecosystem. I'm sure you've probably seen this picture before, but this is just showing you, we're on a coastal system. We have a boat here, our fish, some agricultural life, houses, and also some healthy eelgrass. And so everything is in balance. So there are various nutrient inputs to different parts of the harbor, and like I said before, these excess nutrients can cause eutrophication. Eutrophication is characterized by excessive plant and algal growth due to the increased availability of one or more limiting growth factors that are needed for photosynthesis. So that could be sunlight, carbon dioxide, and nutrient fertilizers. So nutrient additions to aquatic systems can cause shifts in biological processes that can result in habitat degradation. So the harbors receive an excess amount of nutrients through overland and subsurface flow. And these have led to an overgrowth of algae and invasive plants, loss of native species, and depletion of dissolved oxygen in our water, which is actually really important to a lot of aquatic organisms. It's counterintuitive when you think of fish needing oxygen, but they do utilize oxygen in our water. So some examples of nutrient inputs can come from improperly sited or failed septic systems, fertilizers leaching into groundwater, paved roads, as well as mowed entry points diverting stormwater towards the harbor. And this also enhanced nutrient concentrations in rain due to burning of fossil fuels. So when there is an imbalanced amount of nutrients in an embayment, it can negatively affect the entire ecosystem. Like I said before, eutrophication is characterized by excessive plant and algal growth due to the increased availability of limiting growth factors, so for our case, nutrients. And so when these dense algal blooms eventually die, microbial decomposition severely depletes the dissolved oxygen in the water, and it creates a hypoxic or an anoxic dead zone, lacking sufficient oxygen to support a lot of the organisms So in addition to these excess nutrients leading to an overgrowth of algae and invasive plants, these impacts diminish our aesthetic appeal. It also can impact our recreational opportunities and decrease the quality of ecological health both in and around the harbor. And so sometimes this can pose threats to our public health. Our water supply may have negative economic impacts, as this is a big tourist island as well, and it's home to year-round community. There's our fishing industry, and it could affect our property values. And it's also difficult and expensive to reverse. So that leads me to the question of how is water quality important for harbor restoration? As I said earlier, a lot of our habitats are connected. And without our wetlands and salt marshes, for instance, our water would not be as clean, as our salt marsh vegetation helps filter runoff that is going into our water. Or if we didn't have good water quality, our eelgrass would disappear, which we have seen over time throughout the harbor. And then without our eelgrass, our beloved bay scallops would decrease as they utilize eelgrass in their early stages of their life. So because of all of this, if one thing becomes unbalanced, we have a domino effect of sorts. So in order to restore waters back to our historic healthy levels, we established a TMDL, which I'm sure you also have heard, and that's our total maximum daily load, which was created for Nantucket Harbor. And so just a reminder, what a TMDL is, it's the amount of a nutrient, so for our case it would be nitrogen, that a system can receive in order to maintain its healthy habitat. So we kind of have a cutoff point. So in addition to having a TMDL, we are to reduce nutrients. We're also looking on ways to actively restore our water quality through planting of eelgrass, which people will talk again later on through the presentation, as well as stock enhancement of shellfish in our harbors as well, because they filter phytoplankton, which also helps clean the water. So everything is a collaboration. The goals of the water quality program include determining the ecological health of all of our island's water bodies, but since we're focused on the harbor today, Nantucket Harbor, as well as gauging the decline or recovery of the harbor over the long term, and provide the foundation for development of potential alternatives for nutrient and resource management, and also have a quantitative measure of success to make sure these things that we're actually implementing are working. So the town of Nantucket has been working for decades to restore its estuaries and their aquatic resources. And so at present, these are several activities that we're doing to lower our nitrogen enrichment and minimize the negative impacts to water and habitat quality that are ongoing in the harbor. So for example, we have extended our sewer systems as well as reconstructed our jetties, and in addition to a recent fertilizer application by law. We also deploy water quality equipment, such as our multi-parameter water meter sondes, which you can see here, and thanks to the Land Council and the Great Harbor Yacht Club Marine grants, we were able to fund these state-of-the-art pieces of equipment, so thank you. So our water quality monitoring is focused on the summertime conditions. So we sample the harbor once a month, and we do this in the summertime specifically because this is typically when our water quality conditions are the worst, and so this is a critical period for us to look at for resource management. And so in addition to sampling our water, we also take environmental parameters such as the weather, temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen levels, et cetera, and monitor for, obviously, of course, algal blooms. Our water samples, after they are collected, we actually ship them to the School for Marine Science and Technology at UMass Dartmouth. And there they have the ability to take our waters and test them for the parameters listed here. So our nitrate, nitrite, ammonium, chlorophyll, et cetera. So after these samples are processed and the data is sent back to us, and so it informs us of the trends of our current status of our water quality. And I am pleased to at least report that the 2018 water quality has improved since last year, and that the harbor nitrogen levels are actually below the total maximum daily load. So that's great news to hear. So I promise I only have 2 graphs, so I'll try not to bore you with this section. But this is just giving you the 2018 total nitrogen concentrations in comparison to past years, starting from 2015, 2016, 2017, and then we have an average from 2010 to 2014 in the yellow. So just to take away from this, if you just look at the blue, that is our 2018 data. So you can see throughout the different sites, and over the years, it's actually the lowest that it has been. So that is a good improvement that we've had. And I also wanted to include a graph of the average chlorophyll A levels. So this is similar to the last graph. On the x-axis is our stations, and on the y-axis is the chlorophyll levels, and that's in micrograms per liter. So this is just, chlorophyll is measured, for those of you, as a proxy for phytoplankton. So this is what we test for in our water. And so you can see that in Station 5 and 6 are in Pulpus Harbor, and the rest relate to the main basin, since we don't have our map up here. And levels were above average within the upper basins, but they were constant throughout the harbor at the level consistent with a low, moderate nitrogen enrichment. So that's good. And the large blooms that you see in years, the spikes, that's in 2012 and 2010, they have not reoccurred in recent years. So that's also another good thing. So I'll finish with our continued work. Like I said, the harbor activities that we've done in the recent past include our additional sewer hookups, jetty improvements, and oyster aquaculture, which Leah will talk about, will result in even lower total nitrogen and chlorophyll levels, and the likelihood of phytoplankton blooms hopefully will be reduced in the future. So we continue to monitor our waters, but we are big on collaboratively working with a lot of different organizations across the island as a team effort, so we can pair up to keep our harbor beautiful and restore the ecosystem entirely as a whole. So with that, I will pass it on to Emily. Thank you. Taking too long.
So the Land Council's presenter, Dr. Elissa Novak, who is a research assistant professor at Boston University, unfortunately could not be here today, so I'm going to be giving her presentation for her. The Land Council started working with Dr. Novak last year in 2018 to do a general health assessment of some of the eelgrass beds in Nantucket Harbor. And we also began coordinating with her on an eelgrass transplant restoration project off of Monomoy Second Pier. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those projects. Eelgrass is a really significant resource for many reasons, and I'm sure that most of us in this room are pretty familiar with it. In addition to providing crucial habitat for finfish and commercially valuable shellfish, it also serves a lot of other functions. It helps to retain nutrients from the water column, it acts as a carbon sink, and it also provides a really important physical structure in the coastal ecosystem. So it can stabilize sediment, especially in this environment of rising sea level and more intense storms. It will help to prevent erosion. It can attenuate wave energy as storm energy hits the shoreline. It can dampen that to help to prevent erosion. Back in 2015, the Land Council worked with the town to have an additional mapping study of the eelgrass throughout Nantucket's harbors and surrounding waters done as an update from the 1995 survey that had previously been completed. One of the things that became clear from the study is that the harbors had seen a significant decline in eelgrass in various locations. This study is available online, I believe on the town's website, also on the Land Council website. And the decline was seen predominantly in Nantucket Harbor, which is likely a result of increased nutrient levels over time. Eutrophication certainly has a negative impact on seagrasses and eelgrass. As nutrient levels increase, then the impact increases as well. The algae in the water column and other suspended solids can block the light from reaching the plants, which causes a pretty big problem, and also competition for nutrients over time. So the health assessment that we decided to do was based on this notion that the mapping study that had been done showed us that on a large scale, we've seen a decline in the density and the extent of our eelgrass beds throughout the harbor. So we wanted to take a narrower focus and really zoom in on some of these eelgrass beds and get a better understanding of what their health is like and how that compares to eelgrass beds in other places as well. So we chose 6 locations throughout Nantucket Harbor, hoping to get a little bit of a range on land use impacts and development from different parts of the harbor. And we also used a reference site out off of Tuckernuck. The study itself looked at a lot of different characteristics, physical eelgrass bed characteristics, the plant morphology, the number of leaves, the canopy height. We looked at the structure of the eelgrass beds themselves, shoot density, percent cover, and then we also did an analysis of nutrient content in the plants. So we did this using a stable isotope analysis where we collected eelgrass shoots and the blades were analyzed for these stable elements of carbon and nitrogen that last in the plant throughout its life. And when they're accumulated from a certain source, then the source can be determined based on the content of those stable isotopes in the vegetation. And that's important because it can help us to get a better understanding of where the nutrients that these plants are accumulating are coming from. What are the sources? So this data can be helpful in looking at whether the nutrient inputs into the system are atmospheric, are from sources like fertilizer or wastewater. So it's really nice to start to get a better picture of what exactly is feeding into the system. We also did some sediment cores in 3 locations. We did those in Monomoy, Fulling Mill, and Wauwinet. The other eelgrass sites that we studied were at Pimney's Point and off of Quays and off of the north side of Pacamo Point. And the sediment cores are important because we also were looking at sedimentation rates over time. It gives us a better understanding of how sand is moving in the harbor and what kind of impact that might be having on the ecosystem. And we also looked at stable isotopes within the sediment as well to, again, get a sense of nutrient contribution and from what various sources. We paid particular attention to environmental conditions that would be impacting the eelgrass beds, such as light and temperature. So just a sneak peek at some of the results. I don't have most of them here. This is just a graph that shows the canopy height of our 6 different sites, as well as our reference site. And what I can tell you is that the bar on the left is Monomoy, and the sites go up harbor to Wauwinet, and then the bar on the farthest right is Tuckernuck. So some of the data we collected painted a pretty clear picture about the comparison of the eelgrass beds within Nantucket Harbor, where there's a lot more nutrient loading and eutrophication, versus an area like Tuckernuck that has a lot of really good flushing, way less nutrient impact, and you can see that the canopy height is somewhat representative of that in this particular instance. One of the things that was really interesting to see was the difference that we saw in the plants based on the light data as well. So the photographs that you hear on the top are eelgrass beds from Nantucket Harbor, and then on the bottom you can see the eelgrass bed over on Tuckernuck that we were taking a look at. So on the left, the schematic basically is showing that as light hits the surface of the water, it decreases as it travels through the water column when you have a lot of algae and other suspended solids in there. That algae and plant material attenuates that light and can prevent it from reaching the eelgrass shoots down below. And we really found, as you can see from the photos on the top, that throughout the summer in Nantucket Harbor, and I'm sure most of you have seen this for yourselves, there is quite a lot of algae, phytoplankton in the water column, macroalgae that floats in the water column and settles on the eelgrass. And a lot of that is being fed by the excessive nutrients, and it's really preventing the eelgrass shoots from receiving the light that they need to photosynthesize and grow. So eelgrass in the Northeast is limited by light. It needs at least 58% of surface radiance of light in order to grow and expand. And research that's been done has shown that at levels of about 13–14%, which are typically found at the lower edges of the beds as the eelgrass reaches deeper water, that the eelgrass at that point can't survive. And that's sort of one of the thresholds that we find as far as light. And what we saw with the light that we monitored at our sites throughout Nantucket Harbor was that they are largely not receiving enough light. They definitely are light limited during the peak growing season, and that's certainly a big concern. One of the other things that we took a look at as far as environmental conditions was temperature. And this was really interesting because I hadn't seen a lot of consistent temperature data throughout Nantucket Harbor. And one of the things that surprised Dr. Novak was how warm our harbor waters get and for a sustained period of time throughout the summer months. So again, the sites that we monitored throughout the summer last year all had temperatures above 25 degrees C for an extended period of time. And again, that's somewhat of a threshold for the plant's ability to really thrive. They are much warmer temperatures than are seen in other nearby meadows on Cape Cod, including some of the shallow subtidal areas like Pleasant Bay and Orleans and Duck Harbor and Wellfleet, where temperatures don't get quite as high as they do in Nantucket Harbor. So one of the things that we were really able to conclude is that these plants are not only light limited, but they're also thermally stressed throughout the growing season. So the full final report that we've recently received is available on the Land Council website. I invite you all to take a look at it there, and please contact us with any questions. The health assessment was really, I think, important because it provides us a baseline of the state and health of our eelgrass beds as they stand right now. So we'll be able to monitor conditions in the harbor going forward and how they change and how that's going to affect the eelgrass. We'll be able to continue to monitor the nutrients in the plants over time and see how that may change based on a change of inputs from the surrounding watershed. So it was really great to get this baseline data. So in addition, we started working on an eelgrass restoration project, a transplant project. And eelgrass transplanting throughout the Northeast has had some mixed results in various places. Typically, if eelgrass is not growing somewhere, there's a reason for it. So unless you're really going to mitigate for that reason, you may not achieve success. We chose a site to test a new method of transplanting eelgrass off of Monomoy Pier, where the eelgrass had been successfully growing for quite some time, and where the town has documented much better water quality than in other parts of the harbor, where we've been meeting that TMDL for many years, due in large part to the increased circulation from the jetties nearby. So in this particular area, we've seen that a lot of sand movement seems to have buried that eelgrass bed, and it hasn't recovered, but we believe conditions to be adequate for eelgrass to grow there. So we wanted to try this method of planting eelgrass in this location to see if we could kickstart growth again in that bed. And one of the benefits of trying to do this is to see if it's another tool that we can keep in our toolbox for future restoration efforts in places throughout the harbor. Again, we know the benefits of eelgrass, and this kind of project is also really engaging to the community and members of the public to help to educate about the importance of these water quality issues. So the process involved harvesting healthy eelgrass plants from Hussey Shoal was the site we used. We had help from a lot of volunteers, who I hopefully will have all acknowledged at the end. We did a lot of this work with the Town of Nantucket Natural Resources Department, those who were certified to dive and help us out. Plants were collected and harvested and then processed and cleaned up on the boat, then brought over to our restoration site and planted. And as you can see from the photo on the top left and the bottom left, we literally were using a horizontal rhizome method that is like underwater gardening. So you literally take a cluster of those shoots, dig a little hole, and staple them into the ground, bury them up again, and your eelgrass has been planted. So we did that in clumps along transects through 1/4 of an acre. We hope to plant the other 1/4 of an acre this fall. We're going to continue to monitor the success of this over time, every 6 months. From last fall to this spring, we had about an 80% survival rate, so we were pretty pleased with that. Most of the plants were still there taking root, and so we're hoping that they'll continue to spread and coalesce into a more healthy eelgrass meadow in the future. We'll be looking at the health of this bed moving forward using similar methods that we did for the other health assessment study. And then after about 3 years, we'll really start to try to assess the ecological function and see if creatures are actually coming into this habitat and using it again. So again, this contributes to some of the baseline information of how eelgrass is growing in Nantucket Harbor. We know from our health assessment study that our eelgrass is light limited and thermally stressed. So we have this cultural eutrophication, but we also have these warming waters. Again, I think that eelgrass in general used to be much more resilient in the past, but because of all these added stressors, poor water quality, increased boat use, it's just not as resilient as it used to be. We will continue to work with the town to look at water quality and then use that as a guide for potential future transplanting efforts as well, and hope to continue monitoring eelgrass throughout the harbor using a hierarchical approach. So we can look at large-scale mapping of eelgrass to get a sense of percent cover, area, declines, look at more regional parts of the harbors to try to see how things are shifting and moving, and then really hone in and do some more high-resolution studies on a few specific transects that will be more representative to keep a closer eye on what's actually happening in these eelgrass beds. So again, we had a lot of volunteer help and support, especially for the transplant project, which is still ongoing. We will be looking for more help and support next fall to continue with this work if anyone is interested in scuba diving with us to plant some eelgrass or just helping out on the boat. So thanks again for everyone that helped out with those projects. And I will, at this point, move us along in the program. Next up, thank you very much. Next up, I am happy to welcome Leah Cabral, the Town of Nantucket's assistant biologist, to talk about the Oyster Reef Restoration Project.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about eco-benefits of oyster reefs and oysters in general. They have a great filtering ability. So one oyster can filter between 30 and 50 gallons of water a day, which is really significant because it's taking out algae in the water and any sediment that may have caused the water clarity to be poor and making it clear. So this bottom picture shows an aquarium with water in it with algae. And then on the right is the same water, but oysters have been added to it. So you can see that they really clear up the water. They also help promote eelgrass growth. So like Emily had just mentioned, eelgrass needs sunlight. And so by their filtering ability, that light penetration can hit the bottom sediment and allow eelgrass to grow. Oyster shell is made out of calcium carbonate, which is basic on the pH scale. So as shells are put back into the water for restoration, as those shells start to decompose, they release calcium carbonate to help neutralize the water. Oyster reefs can help protect against erosion during storm events. So they act as a natural breakwater for the waves to crash on before it hits the shoreline. And it's also critical habitat to hundreds of different species, including many important recreational and commercial fish. But there is a problem. Worldwide, oysters have declined by 85%. And up here, we only have about 6% of our historic levels. So this map signifies populations around the world, and the red color and the maroon color are either poor or functionally extinct. And then the yellow and the blue color signify either fair or good populations. But you can see most of the populations around the world don't exist anymore. And this can be due to many different reasons. Disease, poor water quality, not returning suitable substrate back into the water, which I'll touch on in a little bit, and storm events as well. But there is a solution, and that is oyster restoration. There are many different restoration projects going on around the coastal United States because restoration scientists have realized how important oysters are due to all the ecological benefits that I had mentioned before. So locally, there's restoration here in Nantucket, in Martha's Vineyard, Wellfleet, Mashpee, and Falmouth. But before you do any restoration, you need to start a shell recycling program because little oyster larvae are chemically attracted to oyster shell. So they need that shell to attach to in order to metamorphosize and become adults. If they don't have that suitable substrate, the larvae ends up dying. So I started the shell recycling program in 2014. And the first 2 years, it was funded by the Nantucket Shellfish Association. We have 30 restaurants and raw bars on island that give us all their oyster and quahog shell. And the shell is picked up year-round, and during the busy season, it's picked up 7 days a week. So from 2014, we have collected over 200,000 pounds of shell, and every year we're collecting more and more shell. In addition, oyster shell is a limited resource. So even if you wanted to buy it, you can't. So we're keeping it out of the landfill and using it as a foundation for building oyster reefs. Okay, so a little background about the Shema Creek Oyster Restoration Project. It took about 3 years to plan it, so we had to collect enough shell to put back into the water for a 1-acre site. And then we also had to collect a bunch of baseline data to determine what area would be good for the restoration before we could even start permitting. And permitting took about a year, so you have to go through state, local, and federal permits. The Shell Recycling Program and Oyster Restoration Project meets 14 of the Town of Nantucket Shellfish Management Plan objectives. And we also collaborated with the Nature Conservancy because they have done oyster restoration all over New England. So they helped decide which location would be great for it, and then they helped during the permitting process, helped design the reef, and help calculate how many pounds of shells we would need for that 1-acre site. In addition, we're collaborating with a wine company called Proud Pour. So this picture on the right is called The Oyster. It's a Sauvignon Blanc, and it's sold on island at Hatches and Annie's Whole Foods. So every bottle of wine sold restores 100 oysters. So their slogan is "Cheers to Change." You're helping the environment as you're drinking. Okay, so why did we choose Shema Creek? It is located where this red arrow is between Pimonees and Abrams Point. And according to the Division of Marine Fisheries, the area where you're going to restore has to be approved for shellfishing. In addition, it cannot have any eelgrass or other shellfish in the area. So it basically has to be a dead zone before you can put any shell back into the water. This area is pretty shallow and has a barrier beach, which helps it during storm events, protect the restoration site. And there is a history of oysters there. So there's actually a couple shell midden piles from the Native Americans located in the area. It is out of harbor users' way, so although the reef is subtidal, which means that it's completely covered during both tides, we didn't want to put it in an area where there's heavy boat traffic. And it serves as a little basin for the Shema and Pulpus watershed. So as that water goes into the marsh area and the restoration site, the hope is that with the oysters there, they'll filter the water before it enters into Nantucket Harbor. Okay, now I'm going to play a video that was produced by Morgan Wraith with funding from the Nantucket Land Council, and this will show you how we actually built the oyster restoration. And let's see. Okay, so the first half of the reef was deployed in 2017, and that consisted of 5 shell rows. And then in 2018, we constructed 3 more shell rows. So it consists of 8 shell rows and 7 bare bottom rows in between those shell rows. And that bare bottom was left there for any benthic and fauna to grow as the reef develops. So the reef would be considered successful if within, over 10 plus years, if these goals have been met. So nothing in nature is quick. We have to give it time to do its thing. But the main goal was to restore a native species that once was there and then was not. So we're bringing it back. And then over time for it to be self-sustaining. So all of the oysters that we grow at the hatchery and bring over to the site, that once they mature and become adults, they start spawning in that area, and all of the recruitment stays there and starts building the reef. And then we want the reef to be an educational platform for any local or visiting scientists to study any aspect of it. And also have long-term monitoring. So we have been monitoring this site since 2015, so before the reef was built, and we will continue it every year from here on out. So I'm not going to go over all of the data collection, but this is the list, and it ranges from water quality sampling to species abundance. Okay, a couple slides for preliminary findings. So every year we put out these things called spat collectors, which are these collectors that have porcelain tiles in them. And they are deployed in June and then picked up in October. And if there are oyster larvae in Shema Creek, they'll attach to this tile, and that's one way that we can monitor natural recruitment. So over the years, it has been increasing. The first year in 2016, we only found one spat attached to the 16 tiles. And then in 2017, that increased to 4. And last year, we actually collected 60 spat. So that either means that the adult oysters on the reef are spawning and the larvae sticking around in the area, or that larvae from the head of the harbor, where all the oyster farmers are, is making its way down and into Shema Creek. In addition, for oyster density, in 2015 and 2016, we found no oysters there, and that was before restoration happened. And then in 2017, per meter squared, there was about 1.3 oysters, and then that increased a little bit last year to 1.4 oysters per meter squared. I've also noticed around the marsh edge where there's ribbed mussels, that oysters are actually attaching to the ribbed mussels and growing, which is pretty awesome. So there are a number of species that we have collected at the reef, either through seine surveys or fish traps. So just to name a couple, we have the common shore shrimp, mummy chug, tautog, American eel, and black sea bass. So in 2016, we collected 17 different species. And then in 2017, we collected 13 species. So that may be due to the temperature of water at the times that we did the seine surveys or put out the fish traps, or even the tide. If it was a little bit lower than we normally collect at, that could cause less species to come into the area, because at high tide, a lot of the fish come into the marsh area. But then again, in 2018, that increased to 18 different species found. As far as water quality, over the 4 years, Thais had mentioned that we need to reach our TMDLs. So this graph shows average total nitrogen in Shema Creek. And you can see in 2015, it's almost at 0.5 milligrams per liter. But then again, in 2018, it declined to about 0.3 milligrams per liter. So over the years, the trend is declining in nitrogen. And that could be due to the oysters that we're putting in there, because oysters use nitrogen to develop their tissue and their shell as well. So it could be, oyster restoration could be one piece of the puzzle for helping to clean our water up in Nantucket Harbor. So because this was a pilot project, there are lessons learned. The first year, I noticed that some of the shell sunk with the first 5 rows that we had installed. This is a map of the restoration site. So the purple signifies the shell foundation that we put in there. And you can see kind of in the middle, there's just blue, which signifies just the bare bottom. So that shell had sunk. The sediment is pretty fine there as you move west towards the marsh. So in 2018, I decided to condense the last 5 rows into 3 rows and double up the shell foundation to hopefully take into account the sinkage that happens. So in the future, if we do restoration in an area where the sediment is really soft, I would suggest either using eco-friendly concrete structures called reef balls, or adding some other foundation on the bottom that could sink in, and then oyster shell on top. There's also silt accumulation on the shell foundation that we put in, because the bottom is so silty that during storm events or boats coming in there, it can stir up the water, and that causes silt to overlay the shell, which could be a problem when oyster larvae is trying to attach to the shell. It might deter it. So in the future, I would recommend doing a sediment budget during the baseline data so that we can anticipate better where the sediment will likely end up. And then this winter, I found some detritus or dead eelgrass and algae that got blown in during the winter storms and deposited on top of the shell. So there's nothing we can do about that. It's nature. But in the future, I would recommend an area where that's even more sheltered during the nor'easters to take into account this detritus that comes in. For future work, I would like to petition the Division of Marine Fisheries and the Board of Selectmen to keep Shema as a sanctuary reef. So that would mean that there would be no shellfishing in the area. It would stay there, the oysters would stay there for all the ecological benefits that they provide. And also because it's an educational platform, we're collecting data every year, so if oysters are taken out, that's really going to skew the data. We're going to continue to collect shell because it is a limited resource and it keeps it out of our landfill. And then continue monitoring the reef so we get that long-term data. And because it is a pilot project, if it is successful and the lessons that we've learned from it, we can expand to other restoration sites within Nantucket waters. And I'm actually working on a potentially new project in Sacajah Pond, and all of the baseline data was funded through the Quidnet-Squam Homeowners Association. So we already have that baseline data, and we can use that to now apply to grants, and we just applied to a grant, waiting to hear back, and that would pay for the engineered plans and the layout of a restoration project as well as a living shoreline in Sacajah. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Leah. That's a great example of how we can take advantage of one declining habitat where eelgrass is no longer thriving and use it to attempt to restore a new habitat. So now I want to welcome Dr. Jennifer Carberg. She is the research supervisor at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and she's going to be talking to us about another harbor resource that we often think of as being more upland, which are salt marshes, and she is going to explain to us why we should really be concerned about incorporating them into our bigger picture harbor view. Thanks, Jen.
All right, thank you, Emily. Here we go. All right, so most of what we've talked about today, as Emily said, has kind of been focused in the water, in the harbor. I work for the Conservation Foundation. I'm the research program supervisor there, and I'm a wetland ecologist by trade. So I tend to work at the interface, so the place that a lot of people ignore. When we're talking about the harbor, we're often talking about the water. We're talking about the sandplain grasslands. We're often talking about the uplands. But I work where these two spots come together. And I'm hoping today to talk to you guys, one, about why we really need to care about salt marshes and what they do for our harbor health, and then some of the research that we're doing at the foundation or planning on doing at the foundation that will help advance kind of the health of these ecosystems over all of Nantucket. So we're talking here about the state of the harbor, so why do we want to talk about salt marshes? And I'm going to do a little intro here at the beginning just to get us all on the same page about what a salt marsh is, where it is on Nantucket, and why we care about it. So this blue here is the island of Nantucket, and all of the pink that you see are all of the salt marshes in Madaket, Nantucket, and Pulpus Harbor. And you can see that we actually have approximately 1,600 acres of salt marsh within all of these areas around our coastlines on Nantucket. About 1,200 of those acres are actually owned by the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, so they're places where we can hopefully affect positive change, restoration, and conservation. Some of the other areas there, and I don't have a pointer, I guess, but we've got the Folgers Marsh, which is partly owned by the Conservation Foundation and UMass Boston. We have a lot of private marsh ownership around the edges of Pulpus Harbor and in the Quays area as well, Quays and Quidnet area. And then we have the creeks, which is that area kind of right there at the bottom of Nantucket Harbor that's owned by the town. So there's a lot of these salt marshes are positioned for protection. They're concentrated within our protected harbors. They're often behind barrier beaches. They tend to establish where wave energy isn't intense every single day. And I'm going to zoom in here on Nantucket Harbor, since that's what we're talking about today, and I include Pulpus because the two are very connected hydrologically, and I consider them one system. Again, the pink are current salt marshes, and then what I want to point out to you are the purple areas, which are actually areas that were historic salt marshes and have been altered over time. Some of these have been restored. So if you look in Pulpus Harbor, there's kind of a purple kidney bean shape. That's the Foundation's Medowie Creek property, and we actually started a restoration project there 10 years ago now, where we reintroduced saltwater flow into what used to be a salt marsh, and we've actually recreated a very excellent, high-functioning salt marsh community there. The purple that's right in the middle is actually just on Pulpus Harbor. It's just the bottom side of Folgers Marsh by the UMass Field Station. That's an area where the water isn't flowing under the road as much as it should be, and there's the potential for a lot of salt marsh restoration there that would also benefit our coastal communities. And then you'll actually see, so that yellow circle is kind of centered on where we are right now. Most of town and Brant Point were all at one point a salt marsh system. You can see it if you're digging foundations on houses, you come across those salt marsh sediments. And when we're talking about, kind of the health of the harbor and what's going into our harbor, thinking about the fact that we've taken away so much salt marsh on the front of town, this is an important area for us as a community to start thinking about what kind of restoration work we could do within that area. So what is a salt marsh? And this is a really nice diagram of kind of a side view of a salt marsh, thinking about where the water goes. So where a salt marsh is all depends on where the land is intersecting that tidal water and how much water the area gets. So underneath, where you're constantly always having water, on the far left side there, that's your subtidal area. It's where we have our fish species. It's where there's always water. And then the intersection with tidal mudflats, and we're kind of moving between where our shellfish are living. Our low marsh is the area that gets flooded twice a day, every single day. So every time the tide comes in, that area is getting inundated with water, often covered by water. And as you can imagine, that's kind of an intense place for any plant to live, where it's constantly getting filled with salt water. So we get very specific plants that grow there. Very specific kinds of animals and organisms can use that area. Just behind the low marsh is where the high marsh is. And these are areas where the soil is always wet, it's always saline, but the surface of the water, or the surface of that soil, is only flooded on occasional high tides. Usually at those highest tides of the month, when you have the full moon, water will get that far back. And then as you move back, you get your border and your transitional area before you get your upland. And you can see that this is all connected. So whatever happens on the upland ends up impacting that salt marsh area at some point. And there's a lot of benefits that salt marshes have. And one of the really important ones, in thinking about a lot of the talks that we've had today, approximately 80% of all commercial and recreational species that are in the Atlantic depend on having salt marshes present for some portion of their life cycle. And when you think about Nantucket and you think about Massachusetts and the things that we value here as a community, scallops, clams, oysters, bluefish, striped bass, flounder, crabs, all of these things need to have a salt marsh present in order to function. And so if you lose your functioning salt marsh, you will lose these species, no matter how healthy your harbor is. So Thais talked a lot about the water quality program that the town is doing and the importance of preventing things like excess nitrogen and phosphorus from getting into the harbor. One of the primary functions of a salt marsh is that they are essentially a nutrient sponge. And so water that moves from the uplands through a salt marsh, if it's carrying nitrogen and phosphorus, the salt marsh will act as a filter and pull a lot of that out. It pulls it out into the vegetation that's growing there, will actually uptake that material before it gets out into the water itself. All of that runoff will get pulled into some of the plant vegetation. It also gets stored in the soils. Salt marshes are really unique in that, their soil isn't sand or clay, it's all organic material. And so the plants that grow in a salt marsh, as they die back each year, because that salt marsh is wet, the vegetation doesn't really break down and decompose. It just accumulates in that soil surface. So the soil is all organic, plant material that's in some stage of decomposition. So because it hasn't completely decomposed, the nitrogen and phosphorus sits in the soil sediments, and it holds onto it so it doesn't get into the harbor. So having functioning salt marshes in place increases water quality and reduces the chance of having some of these extreme algal blooms that we have. So the more filtering capacity on our shorelines through salt marshes, the better. And then one of the other great benefits of salt marshes is that they're essentially nature's soft armoring solution for our uplands, with the fact that they provide an amazing buffer to storm surges and high tide events. So salt marshes, with that organic soil that they have and the capacity of a salt marsh, they can take water that comes in storm surge events, and they actually can hold on to it as a buffer before it reaches that upland. So instead of it just washing straight up, say, a sandy slope and impacting your upland, if you have a salt marsh in front, that water will come in and gets held in the salt marsh. And there's actually, calculations for the height of a wave and how much salt marsh it takes to drop that wave down. So as a wave crashes over a salt marsh, it can actually absorb that energy and slow it down so it doesn't impact your upland. And a recent study actually documented the fact that during Hurricane Sandy, properties that had salt marsh in place were significantly protected from damage from Hurricane Sandy. And it's estimated that approximately, here it's $625 million in property damage was prevented because salt marshes were in place. So now that I have told you why salt marshes are extremely important, and I'm sure we're all on the same page here, I'm going to talk about some of the work that we have been doing at the foundation and then some of the potential work that we're looking towards for doing restoration work to help improve and protect the function of salt marshes. This picture here is our restoration project that we did out in Pulpus Harbor at our Medowie Creek property. These two pictures were taken from the exact same point, 10 years apart. So the picture on the left-hand side is before we did any restoration. It's within the marsh. The marsh had a dike road through it, so no salt water from the harbor was able to get in, no tide events were able to get in. It turned into a freshwater, predominantly cattail-dominated wetland system. And this photo, you can see that plant in the foreground is Phragmites australis, which is a non-native invasive species. And the wetland also had large populations of this non-native species. What we did was just essentially reintroduce salt water back to that marsh, and just changing the hydrology, giving the salt water back, allowed the conversion to, and again, this is the exact same photo. This photo on the right-hand side is a fully functioning salt marsh dominated by, this is salt marsh hay in the front ground, Spartina patens, which is one of the dominant plants within your higher marsh system. We have a lot of species that are using this marsh that weren't previously using it. We have a large population of the salt marsh sparrow that uses this population, and that's a federally threatened salt marsh bird, and it was found in highest abundance here within our restoration project, which is really exciting. So that's one large project that we have done at the foundation. One of the other salt marsh projects we're working on is kind of not so much a restoration of salt marsh, but a monitoring of change in ecosystem function. This is the over on Hither Creek, Millie's Pond. A couple years ago, you all know the vision of the stilt house, which is no longer there. We had an extreme storm event that actually came from the Atlantic on the other side of that house, washed waves over into this pond, and where there used to be salt marsh ringing the pond, there's now sand ringing the pond, as that whole dune system was redistributed across the top of the salt marsh. At the foundation, we were monitoring first whether or not the salt marsh could survive something like that, a deposition of a large amount of sand on top of a salt marsh. So far, it appears that the salt marsh is not surviving. It's buried underneath about 2 meters of sand, essentially, we monitored. But we are getting other vegetation that's coming in across that sand face. So we're starting to see a dune system establishing where there used to be salt marsh. And so we're monitoring what happens when you change from one ecosystem function to a totally different ecosystem function along our coastline. This is a project I'll talk about in more detail in just a moment. This is a salt marsh creek, and you can see that there's extensive vegetation around the creek. Near the creek, there's just areas of exposed soil. And this is something called Salt Marsh Dieback, which is a research project that we're attempting to figure out how to correct in Pulpus Harbor that is essentially a result of high nutrient deposition. And so I will get into a lot of detail about what we're doing with this project in just a second. The other project that we haven't begun yet but we're starting to explore is the potential of figuring out how to remediate these ditches that have been dug into most of our salt marshes all around New England, actually. So this is an aerial photo of a salt marsh, and you can see the ring of very linear, parallel ditches that have been dug out through the salt marsh. A lot of this was done almost immediately after World War II. There was this idea that if we ditch the salt marsh, we will drain the water off the top of it and eliminate mosquitoes. But salt marshes are places where the water comes in and out every day, so you can't really drain water out of a salt marsh. This did not solve the problem of mosquitoes. We still have significant mosquitoes within our salt marshes. So unfortunately, this happened all up and down the East Coast, that this ditching occurred. And what happens when you ditch like this is you get increased loss of your salt marsh because more of the sediment is exposed to oxygen, and the salt marshes just start to die and the creeks get larger. So we're exploring ways of actually trying to plug up and remediate and fix these ditches, and hopefully that is something that will promote the long-term health of our salt marshes around the island. And this is just an example of how we can take some of that salt marsh hay and use it to start to fill in those creeks, and you just fill in so that the water doesn't have a place to go, and the vegetation will hopefully start to grow out on top of it. So that's a good project that we can undertake that will hopefully help our marshes. So I mentioned I was going to talk about Salt Marsh Dieback. This is a project that we have started this year, and it's a pretty exciting research project for us. Salt Marsh Dieback is something that is occurring due to that beautiful crab up in the corner there. This crab is a native crab. It's supposed to be here on Nantucket. It's called the purple salt marsh crab. It eats the grass that grows within our salt marshes. That's its primary food. It's the thing it enjoys the most. You can see this diagram over here on the side, and then an actual photo taken within one of our marshes that's the same picture. What the crab does is that it eats that grass, and it eats all of it. It eats the top, it eats the roots, it eats everything. Something releases this crab. So the crab is usually in balance where it's eating some grass, something is eating the crab, nature's in harmony. Something happens which is usually taking the predator of that crab away, and then the crab populations skyrocket. They eat the grass more aggressively than they had, and they start eliminating it. And they pretty much do this where they move back into the marsh and eliminate all the grass as they grow. They eat everything. In Pulpus Harbor, we have seen this dieback happening, and we think it's because the predators are not in Pulpus Harbor the way they should be. So we've begun to see this progress where we're getting salt marsh dieback, exposed sediment soils within Pulpus Harbor. At the foundation, we decided that we wanted to figure out a way to be the predators and see if we could control the crabs. This process of salt marsh dieback has happened on the mainland, and it happened about 10 years before it started happening here. They've seen recovery over there, but in that time of recovery, you lose a lot of your salt marsh. The sediments erode away, and it's just detrimental to protecting the shoreline and doing all those good things that salt marshes do. So we decided that we were going to kind of take the reins on this, and we were going to remove the crabs from the salt marsh. So this year we went out into 2 places. We dug holes within our soil along the edge of the salt marsh, and you can see a picture of one of our Kotu ranger actually holding a tennis ball can. And we sink these tennis ball cans in so that they're flat with the soil surface. And so as the crabs come out, they're nocturnal, they come out at night, they crawl along the surface of the soil, and they fall into the can. We can then pull the can out the next morning, and then we remove the crabs from the ecosystem. We're taking them and composting them. And so we're taking them out. And so hopefully that will reduce the number of crabs that are eating the grass. At the same time, we're hoping to get plugs of grass, of the salt marsh cord grass, and we're going to plant that out in the marsh at the same time. So kind of a 1-2 punch here where we're taking out the crabs and we're trying to revegetate at the same time. And just to show you real quick what we've been finding, these are the 2 crabs that we found predominantly, the purple crab, which are the purple bars here on the graph. And we've actually, surprisingly, captured a lot of the green crab, which is a non-native crab which eats the eelgrass and just something that we want to get rid of. So we've been taking that one out as well when we're out within our salt marshes. And then the orange bar there are actually fiddler crabs, which are native, and we're putting them back. So total crabs trapped so far, we've got 117 of the purple crabs we've taken out, and 133 each of the green crabs and the fiddler crabs. And you can see that in May and then June, we've increasingly gotten a few more crabs. And we've got a few more weeks of crab trapping onto this as well. So we've probably taken out about 125 purple crabs, which is fairly significant. And I've actually been out to the marsh and seen some of the grass growing back on its own. So we're hoping that we're negatively impacting that crab, and that then when we do that, we'll allow the marsh to resettle itself. And with that, I think I'm out of time, but thank you very much. And if you want more information, there's lots on our website.
Thank you so much, Jen, for presenting that research and bringing salt marshes back into our harbor perspective. So at this time, I want to welcome up Dr. Brian von Hertzen to share with us some of his perspectives on research, past, present, and future research in Nantucket Harbor.
Well, thank you, Emily, and thanks to Jen and Leah and Elliot for setting up the stage so well for what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with this film and then follow up. 99% of the ocean is in fact an aquatic desert. The oceans store 90% of global warming today, and it's storing that heat in the surface of the ocean in a thick, warm layer of water that actually is causing the problem. It's shutting down the currents that go from the deep up to the surface. And when we shut down those currents, we shut down the food source for the plankton. I first had the idea for marine permaculture when I was studying the plankton of the oceans, and I was amazed that half the oxygen we breathe comes from the plankton of the oceans. And it's the plankton forests and the kelp forests that we have to restore in addition to our land forests to really balance the earth and balance carbon in the Earth's atmosphere. Kelp forests are one of the most miraculous ecosystems on Earth. The kelp forest and the kelp species of Macrocystis is the fastest growing tree on Earth. It can grow nearly 0.5 meter per day. These kelp forests are the fastest growing primary production that we have on the planet. And restoring these kelp forests is an opportunity to create an entire ecosystem. Not only are we restoring primary productivity, but we're creating habitat and food for fish. What we're planning to do is in several phases demonstrate the ability to grow kilometer-scale forests in the middle of the ocean. So that film we did with our filmmaker Fritz Moser, who has been an instrumental assistant in helping us to really showcase the challenges and the opportunities that we have region by region to develop and enhance our ecosystems. We're blessed here in Nantucket with incredible ocean resources. We're a big ocean island, if you will. And in that sense, it presents enormous opportunities and responsibilities as we go forward to figure out how can we actually live sustainably with the natural ecosystems and our economic needs as we go forward. At the Climate Foundation, we try to address food security at a regional and global level, ecosystem regeneration at the same time, and then measure the carbon export that comes from the salt marshes, from the oyster beds, from the seaweed and kelp forests, and actually from the seagrasses. And these ecosystems work together in remarkable ways. Last year, I had the opportunity to do some diving on the reefs off of Bali. And what I was amazed at when I went out snorkeling, right next to the harbor, was finding within 10 square meters healthy seagrasses, healthy seaweeds, and healthy coral reefs working together vibrantly in the same patch of 10 square meters. To me, that was amazing, because the traditional understanding is that these ecosystems compete with each other for area. But when you see that ecosystem services are being provided by each ecosystem helps the other one, that was a remarkable and surprising outcome that I think we can learn a lot from as we go forward. So I did a little work to, let me set this up for presenting. I did a little work to look at the history of Nantucket Harbor. I was very pleased to find that the Library of Congress has this map dating back to 1848, showing the historic levels of, and geography, if you will, of Nantucket Harbor and how it's changed over the centuries. And to me, this is really profound, because we have no living memory of the salt marshes that were so eloquently mapped and diagrammed before we all were born. And yet, those are really important, because we live with shifting baselines. We have our own memory of what we grew up with as children. I grew up on Cape Cod and near Woods Hole, and was able to see what was present and what wasn't present during that time. And now we have a shifting baseline, as represented by this satellite view of the modern version of Nantucket Harbor. And it's very notable to me that how much of the sand has moved, how much of the sand has changed. Some of it from human-caused sources, others from storms and other events. And so understanding these man-made changes and these natural changes that have occurred not over decades, but even over centuries, is really profound, because, you know, as a resident of Cape Cod, I love to go diving and snorkeling, and I don't think I've yet found a codfish. And yet, if I'd been born 200 or 300 years ago, that would have been how I made my living, was fishing codfish, because 300 years ago, I think every able-bodied young person that was able to was out there fishing cod. And yet, we don't have cod here anymore. And that's really a profound change. And so I think this comparison between this 1848 wonderful depiction of the way things were and this 2019 satellite view of the way things are, I think is fascinating and something we should look at in more detail, because it's going to tell us about water flow. It's going to tell us about habitats. And if we understand what was pre-industrially, we can actually look at how to regenerate ecosystems on a massive scale and manage our water quality really effectively. And part of it is reducing nitrate inputs into the water. Others are introducing ecosystems that can absorb plenty of nitrogen. And then thirdly, managing the amount of water that can flow through Nantucket Harbor, because that'll determine how well circulating is it, and how we can manage the temperatures and we can manage the nutrient levels by managing the circulation of that water. And so understanding what existed historically is really profound. Now, I'm happy to say there are a lot of species of eel grasses and seagrasses, and each of them can provide habitat for so many of the fauna that are valuable to us. Here's a picture of some of the species of eel grasses, and I'm very happy we still have eelgrass on Nantucket and in Woods Hole. And in fact, back in 2006, I was fortunate enough to be the first person who saw a manatee on Cape Cod. And no one believed me. I was a member of the Quissit Yacht Club, and that year I was questioned very pointedly about my observations. But my friend of 50 years, John York, and I were in Gansett Harbor. I was rescuing a neighbor's wallet from the dock and the pier that had fallen into the sea. And after searching for an hour and finally finding the wallet, my reward I was just resting after I'd been diving, was seeing this very large object go by me from just 1 or 2 meters away. And I thought at first it was a stingray, because I saw a flat circular-shaped object, which looked a bit like a stingray. So I decided to follow it. And as I got a little further forward, I realized it was the manatee, the fuselage of a manatee, and it was about 8 or 9 feet long. So this is really significant to me because it's an example of nature telling us the water's getting warmer, we're moving further north, we're going to change. And it was also, I swam alongside the manatee for about 10 minutes, and I noted that the manatee was so comfortable that the manatee went down and actually chewed on some eelgrass on the bottom of Gansett Harbor, which I thought was really incredible. His favorite food is eelgrass. And so for about 10 minutes, I was very fortunate to be alongside that manatee, seeing what was going on. And we managed to report it to the mammal rescue group, and they endeavored to rescue some of these manatees in subsequent years. But this is a great example of nature talking to us. And nature is talking to us and telling us what is changing and what these changes mean for the species that we are caretakers for. And I think that's really profound because it tells us what we need to do in different regions of the world. This species biodiversity is really key to being climate resilient, and we see this as a big challenge. I just ran across this title from Neil Gibbons. Believe it or not, this was written in 1967, and I knew about stalking the wild asparagus, but I never knew that he was stalking blue-eyed scallops back in 1967. And it's a bit of a boom or bust proposition. We see enormous variation in the population of blue-eyed scallops naturally, and the bay scallops. But I think it's really key. This is one of my favorite blue-eyed scallops, and it's just really profound. I mean, these creating ecosystems that enable us to live in harmony with a wild abundance is really our challenge and our opportunity, and it's something that I look forward to every day when I go snorkeling, whether it's on Cape Cod or here in Nantucket. So I want to just showcase how important eelgrass is for other species. I'm very pleased to see these green shrimps and these worms and nudibranchs and snails and even these pufferfish that are all beautifully disguised. I will say that when I got the chance to dive in some seagrass on Bali, it was very remarkable the number of sea snakes that were there at the time. And believe it or not, they managed to encourage the very green algae that grows on the outside of the eelgrass. They grew on the outside of their skin. So these black and white banded sea snakes turn this incredible color of green that's absolutely identical to the green of the seagrass. So if you go out snorkeling there, you see about a half a dozen sea snakes on any given occasion. It's remarkable how well camouflaged they are, but also how important this habitat is for this variety of marine species, including crabs and including a beautiful seahorse. I was able to, if you ever get to Woods Hole, they have a number of these seahorses at the aquarium, and these are really significant members of the community as well. So there are different densities of seagrasses and eelgrasses. It's great to go to be able to enhance a sparse or missing environment into a highly dense seagrass forest, which can be the habitat for so many more fishes. And what is significant to me is that we can find seagrass beds that are living together with live corals and living together with wild seaweeds. And the reason I think the seaweeds are so profound and significant is that our research shows that those seaweeds are able to absorb and pull down nitrate as fast or faster as any of the seagrass beds. So it creates the possibility of a cascade of ecosystems, that we go from land to salt marshes to perhaps seaweed mariculture that can draw down the nitrate that is going into our harbors that much more quickly. So by the time we get to the eelgrass, the levels are low enough that we're not growing algae on our eelgrass and cutting off light, but we have seaweed mariculture absorbing a lot of those nutrients and perhaps creating some sustainable economic opportunities. Because we're finding that there are a lot of uses for seaweeds. We've identified a dozen so far. And by building a sustainable seaweed industry, as we have already done in Asia, we can actually have a profound difference and a profound effect on the water quality at the same time that we're addressing the needs for these ecosystems. So we see that as a really big opportunity. I've found here a reconstruction of Buzzards Bay seagrass habitat reconstructed from 1600, the way it looked in the 1980s and the way it looked in 1996. And there's been a profound change in the amount of seagrasses that we've seen. And it's a big opportunity to try to regenerate that. Now, I have gone my father and I used to go cohogging in Wacoit Bay before 1971. And to me, seeing this difference of just a few decades where we had profoundly different amounts of seagrass available, I think is really significant. And our opportunity to manage the temperatures by water circulation and manage the nutrient levels by having sustainable cultivation of seaweeds and other crops. And in fact, the oysters have this profound effect. I've seen this in different geographies. And we have oysters in my home harbor of Little Harbor. Falmouth, the town of Falmouth has put in oysters, and it's already beginning to draw down those phytoplankton and bringing the nutrient levels down. This is a huge opportunity to have a sustainable economy and also be helping out those ecosystems and helping to regenerate those ecosystem services. Here's a comparison of the amount of eelgrass that we get, the area and the habitat, that's on the vertical axis. The horizontal is as you get more and more nitrogen loading over on the right side, you get less and less eelgrass area and habitat. So that correlation is really profound and significant, and it's one that has an enormous effect on the eelgrass outcomes. And the eelgrass, of course, is essential for the habitat formation. So here's a picture of the different species around the world. It is largely depleted so far, but with a good understanding of what is working today and the ecosystem as it is, we need to see, where is the eelgrass? How can we regenerate it? I was born in California, here off Morro Bay. We used to have a lot more seagrass and eelgrass than we do today. And so this is a challenge and an opportunity for us to not let the baseline shift, but actually regenerate those ecosystems and the associated economies. There's a wonderful book that I've come across called the Eelgrass Restoration Handbook, How, When, and Where of Restoring and Transplanting Eelgrass, and I think that's a great guide. It's one that enables us to make this really work and get the community involved in actually transplanting some of these eelgrasses, which I think is a huge opportunity for the future, and at the same time to address these economies, which I think begins with the incredible scallops that we have available to us. It includes the oysters, it includes the forage fishes that can have a profound effect on our future. I was very surprised and pleased that Rebecca found some of these seagrass applications that include making textiles and furniture, includes in Denmark surprising uses that seaweed and seagrass is actually used to cover houses. Imagine that. And I really want to take a moment to discuss, to just mention the support that we've had from a number of foundations, including the Great Harbor Yacht Club Foundation. We're part of their Scientific Advisory Council. We're really looking forward to working with them here and in Woods Hole to ensure that we can regenerate these ecosystems and regenerate sustainable economies that are local. And with that, I will enable the happiest scallop to thank you for all your support in regenerating this healthy ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Brian, and to all of our presenters this evening. We wanted to showcase not just research, but restoration efforts on island at this year's State of the Harbor Forum. And I think that this was a real great variety of some of the projects that are taking place right now, and how we're really looking beyond just restoring our water quality and trying to revert things back to the way they once were, but we are all realizing that we need to adapt to the changes around us and find ways to make these harbor ecosystems more resilient, and creative approaches, as you just heard about, for moving forward in the future. And speaking of the future, I wanted to just ask Jeff Carlson, the director of the town's Natural Resources Department, to say a few words about where the town is looking to take its research in the coming years, and then we will conclude with our question and answer session.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see another full house for the third one. I think I'm in an exclusive club where I've had to talk at all three of these things, so I'll try to be brief. But want to talk a little bit about the direction that the town is headed. And I think in the last really 18 to 24 months, the town has taken a really new and innovative approach to dealing with a lot of these issues, and has really been challenged by our select board and the people that attend those meetings and through town meeting to really start addressing not only our water quality issues, but our general coastal adaptation and coastal resiliency, and really looking at these ecosystems holistically to come up with solutions that not only continue our existence here and our quality of life, but also improving the ecosystem around us. So for those who may or may not be aware, recent developments, the town of Nantucket has begun its strategic plan through its select board, where they've identified 3 main goals. And the 3 goals of that plan are to address housing, to address transportation, and then to also address what they're calling environmental leadership. And the main deliverables from that are how we're going to maintain sustainability on the island, not only economically, but with energy and landfill and solid waste, but then also developing a long-term water quality plan as the second deliverable to that. That initiative couples directly with a lot of what we talked about today. How are we going to be resilient? You know, I think most of us in this room, and a lot of us here at least read the paper, are aware that we've had some pretty significant environmental effects and environmental impacts in the last 2 to 3 years. Some of the big ones that come to mind, obviously, those who were here a winter or 2 ago probably remember the pretty significant sewer break downtown related to that coastal storm event and how we dealt with that. Erosion is obviously a huge issue, and that's something where they've committed to not only continuing adding staff and expertise to be here all of the time, but also creating citizen work groups to provide opportunities to prioritize projects and events and things that are there. So I think the challenge that's come through the town and the challenge that's come to our department and the Board of Health and the Public Works and Planning is pretty loud and clear. And we need to do a better job of making ourselves more successful in the future and buffering our impacts. And I think that's where we've seen such great support and new community invigoration through the Land Council and their water fund, through the Great Harbor Yacht Club and their foundation, through the Conservation Foundation, and some new efforts and kind of expanding their areas and really doing some great work. But I think really what it comes down to at the end of the day is, and kind of my plea for the day in the future as all of these things go forward, is to everyone in this room, please participate. Everyone here has something to contribute that can be meaningful and provide an understanding or a contribution to any one of these initiatives. I think everyone that's in the room today obviously cares enough to be here and learn about the harbor. We have a very diverse crowd. We have fishermen and ecologists and researchers and citizens and people that like to go boating and do things and fish, but we're all here because we care. And I think what I'm asking today is for everyone to participate, contribute, not only financially, but resources that they have. Talk to the researchers and say, what could I do in my own yard? What can I do at my house? What questions should I ask my landscaper? What should I be doing to manage my septic system? Do I have a septic system? Am I on sewer? I get that question a lot. People need to know. And those are the things that can really make significant differences that you can make day to day without changing your life to do. And that, that's the goal that the select board has set forth and tasked us with. We've really been working for the last almost decade now. The Natural Resources Department in the town was really founded in 2011 and kind of an offshoot from the Marine and Coastal Resources Department. And when we first started, I will fess up that it was me by myself. And then Tara Riley, our wonderful town biologist, came with, and we've slowly been adding. And the town has understood having experts with us all of the time is really what provides that citizen portal and that 24/7 access for questions and answers, and collaborating with our other like-minded groups is important. And we've seen that commitment to the town through increased staffing and increased budgeting. And as we see other programs get developed, keeping that sustainability and that environmental stewardship in mind. So I think that's really the direction in future we're going. So again, thank you guys all for coming very much. I'll turn it back over to Emily, and I look forward to seeing each and every one of you at a select board meeting or a conservation commission or a coastal resiliency advisory committee or town meeting or another nonprofit meeting. And I look forward to seeing and speaking with you all there, and look forward to see what everyone here can contribute to our better environmental stewardship and long-term sustainability. All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff, for that update and information. I am going to ask our presenters to take their place at the panel up front so that I can just see if there are some questions from the audience. I also wanted to, while I have your attention, thank everybody again for being here this evening, and Just let you know that as the Land Council moves forward with our eelgrass research and our green crab research and a lot of the other water programs, working with our partners that are here today and beyond, we invite you to join us and to become a part of our Water Fund Founders Circle, to get in touch with us with any questions or concerns you have. We're thrilled at the developments the town has made. We're thrilled to be able to work more closely with the Great Harbor Yacht Club and their new foundation in the future, and to collaborate with all of the other partners on these projects. So with that, I would welcome any questions for our speakers.
If anyone has an update pertaining to the Army Corps of Engineers remediation efforts of the unexploded ordnance from the formerly used defense sites, and how that could negatively impact or contaminate the groundwater and the harbor water supply.
I'll try my hand at this. So I am aware of that. I'm sure that I can't say that there would be no impact whatsoever, because that's something that is there. We haven't looked at that specifically, but that's something that I can definitely look into and research, and later on I get your email address and follow up with you, because that's a great question.
Given that several speakers touched on the importance of water circulation for cleaning the harbor, and that it's so hard to get the water to move at the head of the harbor, I wondered if anybody had any opinion on whether, if a channel was opened between the ocean and the head of the harbor on a regular basis, this would improve the situation in Nantucket Harbor.
Thank you for that question. I think that we should study this very closely, because pre-industrially, there's good evidence that the channel was open. There's an enormous potential for flow of water through there, and also an opportunity for enhanced fisheries. You have many examples of forage fish and other fish species that will flow through those openings, and that presents an additional habitat for them, and also a chance to cycle with multiple trophic levels of fishes in the harbor. In addition, it's going to lower the water temperatures in Nantucket Harbor significantly, and we could measure that. And we could also expect to measure the lowering of nitrate levels as a result of that connection. So I think it's something we should explore as a community and consider the possibility of doing it.
Thank you. Yes, I absolutely agree. I think it's going to be important to explore that moving forward. Obviously, we always want to keep perspective on the watershed impacts and make sure that just being able to flush the system out doesn't prevent us from eliminating some of those inputs to start with. That's always a really important place to start. And then I think along with that, monitoring or investigating the impacts that it will have to the inner harbor system, all the sediments that have gathered up at the head of the harbor over time because of the poor water quality that have settled there, and the internal loading. But starting to really look into the possibility of that in the future is going to be an important option.
I'll just add that in addition to decreasing the sources of nitrogen and increasing the sinks of nitrogen inside the harbor, that with this kind of a flushing capability, one configuration or more would enable the ability to turn on and off the water connection between the ocean and the harbor, and that's something that would enable either the flow of water or pausing that if there were any problems observed. So it's an interesting approach that we should explore further. That's a great question about the septic challenges. And having grown up on Cape Cod myself, I'm very frustrated because I asked these questions in the 1970s. And I was told by my stakeholders, my teachers, that the septic systems took care of it. But we've come to find out that the nitrate and some of the phosphate is not taken care of, and we need to find best practices there. We are familiar with some decentralized approaches that can actually address the nitrate and the phosphate. Those technologies are in development across the globe, and it's something that should be considered in addition to the traditional approaches.
And then just to add to that, the town has certainly taken a more aggressive approach at requiring inspections and upgrades to more innovative alternative systems within the Nantucket Harbor watershed. So a lot of the more antiquated systems have been and are being upgraded in addition to some of the sewer extensions that are taking place. So there has been a lot more movement on the part of the town in those areas.
Hi, I'm Peter Morrison with the Shellfish Association, a proud sponsor of Leah's work over the past 5 years, creating working oysters in the harbor. My question, Leah, is if there were 25 Leah Cabrals available, what are the prospects for scaling this up if we wanted to build oyster reefs all over the place to filter the water?
Thank you for that question, Peter. Yes, so like I mentioned in the presentation, you have to do at least a year of collecting baseline data. So if there were more of me, we could do that in other locations around Nantucket Harbor, Nantucket, but it has to be in areas where there's no eelgrass, there's no other shellfish. So that is a bit limiting on Nantucket because we do have eelgrass, although it is declining. So that would be the first step, is to do the baseline data and also do some oyster growth studies to see if we do put oysters in this area, are they going to actually grow?
I'd like to add that from my experience in Bali, this traditional view of either one habitat or another habitat, either one ecosystem or another ecosystem, is something we might be able to work to get beyond. It requires a change in the approach and the rules and the regulations, but I can see oyster beds and eel grasses working side by side and hand in hand to make the water clearer and more healthy ecosystem. So I think encouraging work in that area would be very promising. I also want to note that there are automatic versions that can amplify Leah's work, and that is these little drones that run around on solar power and they take pictures of the bottom and they do a lot of remote sensing, can help create baselines that can multiply the effectiveness of the people that we do have working in this area. It's new technology, but it's something that we could potentially survey all of Nantucket Harbor and beyond, including the other seagrass areas around Nantucket, to really look at what the opportunities are as we go forward. So I would encourage looking at technology that can amplify the work that's being done so well here.
When you talked about, when you talked about the missing predator, what was that?
They think that it's most likely fish. Striped bass definitely eat the crabs. And we're thinking that the poorer water quality in Pulpus Harbor has led to a decrease in at least the number of predators that are making it all the way back and finding it worthwhile to stay in Pulpus Harbor. We haven't actually done the predator surveys, but that is the work that has happened elsewhere, and that seems to be the driving factor in why the crab populations increase. So they're not there, so we can be there instead.
I'd also like to add that this idea of actually increasing circulation in the harbor could substantially increase oxygen levels, which was noted today as a key factor for the striped bass. We do see a lot of striped bass even in Eel Harbor, in Woods Hole, which is unusual, but with a high tidal flux, if you get enough flow, we do see good evidence for these predators getting back into the head of harbors.
I have a question over here. Nobody's mentioned acidification in ocean water, and I'm wondering how that affects the community in general, especially shellfish, and I would think the spat and the juveniles, as they're just starting to build shells, would be affected by an acid medium.
So ocean acidification is definitely a problem, and especially on the West Coast, a lot of hatcheries there have to actually add in product to make their water more basic. Here in Nantucket, we haven't seen that acidification on a huge level like in California, but it is something that we should monitor. And during the water quality sampling events, we do pH levels at the different stations, so that helps monitor it during the summer. But going forward, we should monitor it more closely.
One thing we're finding on the coral reefs from Australia to Hawaii is the key thing that's affecting these reefs, and I'm going to add some of the oyster reefs to that, is temperature and nutrient levels and habitat today. So what's striking there is the temperature. In the future, the ocean acidification could become a factor. It is a factor today in Puget Sound, in Washington, and also in parts of Canada, but it's mainly in high latitudes that we're seeing ocean acidification problems today. By far, the greatest effects, something that even affects here in Nantucket Harbor, is the high temperature. The high temperature of the water is going to affect the survival of these species and these foundational species that create ecosystems. So our challenge and our opportunity are to manage the temperatures and the nutrient levels, and then ultimately help these ecosystems photosynthesize enough to draw down the ocean acidification. We see in healthy seaweed beds and kelp forests a reduction in ocean acidification that is profound. These systems can naturally draw down enough carbon to really reverse locally and regionally the effects of ocean acidification. If we can get nature back on track with healthy ecosystems, she can do remarkable things to give us climate resilience as we go forward.
Okay, well, with that, I think we will wrap up our program. Thank you again so much for coming, and to all of our sponsors. And thanks again to all of our presenters. We will all be around if anybody has additional questions for us, and please enjoy a drink and the raw bar.